And good evening, class. So this is Algebra 1, Lesson 1.4. You always want to make sure that indeed you are watching the correct lesson, and this is subtracting integers. Algebra 1, Lesson 1.4, subtracting integers. All right, when you think of subtracting integers, what are we really doing? So I'm going to put up here it implies, I'm going to go to red. What are we really doing when we're subtracting integers? In algebra, it's good to think of it as adding the opposite of a number, and then I'm going to go to adding the opposites of a number, and I'm going to underline opposite in red. Adding the opposite of a number. So number one, as you remember when we dealt with adding positive and negative numbers, I said a key was to think of the numbers as either positive or negative. You have so many positives, so many negatives. It's the same concept here. We're adding the opposite of a number. So just a reminder, form. So if you had something like this, A, and I'm going to use my red here for the minus sign, A minus B. Remember that this is another way, really a shorthand for writing A plus and then a negative B. A plus a negative B. Now those two are exactly the same, but again in algebra we're going to save the keystrokes, and by writing A minus B it saves us from writing the plus and then the parentheses and the minus. Those are exactly the same thing, Now, if you were to use numbers, then it might look something like this: 5 minus 13. 5 minus 13, and again that is the same as 5 plus a negative 13. So again, you look at 5 minus 13 and you're better off thinking 5 positives and 13 negatives versus 5 subtract 13. Just a whole lot better off thinking of it as 5 positives and 13 negatives instead of thinking of it as 5 subtract 13. And of course we dealt with this topic earlier and how to solve this kind of a problem. Remember, 5 of the 13 negatives wipe out the 5 positives, and so you'll need to count how many negatives remain. Start at 5 because you've already wiped them out. Count up to 13. From 5 to 13 is 8. 8 negatives remain, and of course the solution would be negative 8. Right, that's what's going on with positive and negative numbers. All right, well, we've already done problems like that. We've already done problems like 5 minus 13. So that's not really the idea of this lesson. It's more to get into this scenario. So number 2, what does, and I'm going to go to red for these next couple words, minus a minus. What does minus a minus? What does minus a minus mean? What does minus a minus mean? Okay, well, there's a couple ways to look at these situations. Minus is synonymous with, again, negatives. But a minus can also be considered as opposite. So minus is definitely those many negatives, but you can also think of it as opposite. So let me show you what I mean. So by way of example here, let's suppose we had something like this. 10, I'm going to use my color here, minus in red. Back to blue for parentheses, I'm going to put that 3 in the back, and then I'm going to take my red again and do a minus 3. So I have 10 minus parentheses a minus 3. 10 minus a minus 3. So let's try to interpret this. Okay, so we have 10 positives, right? So that's 10. And that can be in blue. So that's 10. We've got 10. You can think of this minus, because there's 2 of them in a row, opposite, minus a minus, you can think of it as opposite. So I want 10 opposite of, and I'm going to throw the word of in there, 10 opposite of, and then what do we have? 3 negatives. 10 and the opposite of 3 negatives. So what do we really have? 10. What is the opposite of a negative? A positive. So I want 10 and the opposite of 3 negatives. That would be 3 positives. And what is this problem? 10 plus 3. Answer 13. I mean, that's really what's going on. That's the concept of it. If I were in front of you right now in class, I would show you that a minus, two minuses in a row, would spin you around right back to the way you began. So in other words, I would say, okay, right is positive, left is negative. If I were standing in the heading to the right in the positive direction and a negative sign all of a sudden came my way, it would tell me to go opposite, and I would show you an about face. But then if I had another negative sign again, opposite again, and I would spin about face again, and I'd be right back in the positive direction. So minus a minus is a plus, and we're going to write that. So minus a minus equals a plus. Minus a minus equals a plus. And that's what we want to do with our work. And so let's do some problems. Minus a minus equals a plus. Minus a minus equals a plus. So number 3, problems. Minus a minus equals a plus. Okay, A. Let's suppose we had this, 17, and I want to keep using my color here, so I'm going to go to red. I'm going to put 2 minuses in a row here with some room to put a parentheses. Then back to my blue, parentheses, minus 8. So here's what I want you guys to think. Whenever you see minus a minus, I'm going to circle them in green. And I'm going to cross them out, and I'm going to put a plus sign in between. Now, we won't always take the time to write this, but just for clarity's sake, now what do you have? Those 2 negatives became a plus, and you have a 17 plus 8. I mean, that's what you have. The 2 negative signs in a row became a plus. Now, this happens anytime there's parentheses, parentheses or not. Remember, we've already dealt with absolute value. That is one situation where you cannot apply the minus rule if the negative number is inside an absolute value. So it's a different situation. But again, 2 minuses in a row are a plus, and we all know that the answer to this thing is 25. Right? Minus a minus is a plus. I mean, that's just the way they go. Doesn't matter if the smaller number's in the front, the bigger in the back. Let's do another one. Let's go 4. Get my red again. 2 minuses in a row. Again, a parentheses, because that's just proper etiquette when 2 things are in a row. Let's put a 7 in the back. So row you have 4 and the opposite of 7 negatives. But in reality, you just know, hey, 2 negatives in a row. I'm going to cross them out and put a positive in its place. So again, one more time for clarity's sake, what do we have? This is a 4 plus a 7, and we all know that's an 11. 4 plus a 7 is an 11. Okay? Let's do another one. C. All right, what about something like this? How about negative 10, and we'll do it all in blue here, negative 10 minus a minus 3. And again, that minus 3 would be in a parentheses, would be the proper etiquette. Okay, do you see the minus in a row again there? They're not in red this time, but you can see them. So again, where these are, we're putting a plus sign in its place. And in your work, that's what I should see. I should see you circling those 2 minus signs, putting a line through it, and putting a plus up above it. That's what I should see. That's what's going on. Okay, now be careful here. In this problem, what are we left with? 10 negatives and 3 positives. So again, remember, 3 of the 10 negatives wipes out the 3 positives, so we have to figure out what's left. So again, we know our answer is going to be negative because there's more negatives than positives. And really all we have to do is start from 3 and count to 10 to tell us how many negatives are left. So start at 3, count to 10, you get to 7. So how many negatives are left? 7 negatives, and the answer is negative 7. And that's what we're doing with positive and negative numbers. positive and negative numbers. Okay, one more. There can be all kinds of variations of these. What if you have negative the negative in the front? How about negative, a negative 13, and let's go minus 20. Negative a negative 13 minus 20. Now if you want to think about it for a minute, pause the video, and otherwise I'm going to go on here. But again, what do we have? We have minus a minus, so I'm circling that, crossing it out. That's really a plus 13. All right, be careful here. This is the kind that gives students trouble. When the minus sign is between the front and back number, and the back number is larger than the front. This is 13 positives and 20 negatives. 13 positives and 20 negatives. So 13 of the 20 negatives wipe out 13 positives. Let's count how many negatives are left. There are 7 negatives left, and it just so happens I picked one that ends up to be negative 7 again. Okay, 7 negatives are left. Minus a minus is a plus. Minus a minus is a plus, and that actually should have been a D, shouldn't it? That's good. That's a D. All right, E. Look what can happen here. All right, let's use our red. What if we had minus a minus a minus? Minus a minus a minus. 3 of them in a row. Okay. Any 2 of them, doesn't matter whether you do the first and second or the second and last, is going to be a positive. What's a negative times a positive? And the answer is a negative, right? And this answer is this is going to end up being a negative thing. Whenever you have 3 of them in a row, it's going to be negative. What if you had 4 of them in a row? 4 of them in a row. Look what happens. 1, 2, 3, 4 of them in a row. Negative and negative is a positive. Negative and negative is a positive. Positive and positive is positive. So from these 2 examples, you can begin to make a general conclusion. Whenever there are an even number of negative signs in a row, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, etc., it's always going to be positive. Whenever there are an odd number of negative signs, 1, 3, 5, 7 of them, etc., then it's going to be negative, and that is the case, and that is the way it works. All right, we have to review fractions again. So fractions in this idea of minus a minus, and so let's do a couple examples here with fractions. So number 4, fractions. A. All right, so let's suppose we had something like this. 3/5 minus a minus 9/5. 3/5 minus a minus 9/5. Now, I've always instructed you to show the rule step. So we're going to add the numerators and put them over the common denominator, right? So the common denominator is 5. Now, what do you got on the top? You have the 3 from the 3. You've got this negative sign, do you not? And then you've got this negative 9, do you not? And that's when you want to use a parentheses. So look what we have in the numerator, 3 minus a minus 9. So what are you thinking? I hope you're thinking minus a minus is a plus. And now we have 3 and 9 is 12. And we have 12/5, and we'll just leave it as an improper fraction, right? 12/5. All right, let's do another example. B. Another example. All right, how about something like this? Minus 5/8 minus a minus 7/10. Minus 5/8 minus a minus 7/10. Okay, so look, we're looking at this and we're saying, hey, to add or subtract fractions, I better have a common denominator, and I don't have one. Now, if you remember how to determine the lowest common denominator, you can use the LCM to figure that out. Okay, most students will look at a problem like this and figure out what the lowest common denominator is. Some students will just use the 8 and the 10. It'll be a common denominator, but not the lowest. So let me refresh your memory if you want to use the LCM. How do you figure out LCMs? You have to factor the denominator. An 8 is a 2 times 4, and a 4 is a 2 times 2. So I'm going to do this off on the side. So remember, an 8 is a 2 times 2 times 2. Factor the 10 in black, it's a 2 times 5. So what is the 10? A 2, and remember I taught you guys to line up your factors. So I don't want to put a 5 in a 2 column, I'll put it way out in the back. Draw your line in green, the LCM, which in this case is the same as the LCD, the lowest common denominator. It's going to be the factor representing each column. A 2 for that 2 column, a 2 for that 2 column, a 2 for that 2 column, and a 5 for the 5 column. That's the LCD. So now to get your number to the LCD, look at what your number is missing. So look at the red over here for the 8, 2 times 2 times 2. You see how the 8 is missing the 5? So I need to multiply it by a 5 on the bottom to get it to the LCD. Whatever I do to the bottom, I do the same thing to the top. Now look at the 10. The 10 is missing 2 things. It's missing one of the 2's and another of the 2's. And a 2 times 2 is a 4. And so we're going to multiply it by 4 on the bottom. Again, whatever I do to the bottom, do the same thing to the top. Now, we would have gone over this, in a little bit more detail, a little bit more slowly in pre-algebra. So this is review. So again, what do you technically have? I'm going to simplify this so we get a good look at what's here. Okay, so what do you have on the top? A negative 5 times a 5. That's a negative 25. Now you could have left it out in front or put it in the numerator. And what's on the bottom? An 8 times 5, and that's a 40. Okay, we still have the minus in between. On the top of the second fraction, negative 7 times 4 is a negative 28 over a 10 times 4, which is 40. See how you've got your common denominator? So again, now we've got to add the numerators and put them over the common denominator. So I'm going to show the rule step. Negative 25 minus a minus 28 over 40. Negative 25 minus a minus 28 over 40. Okay, what's this lesson about? Minus a minus is a plus. There's my 2 minuses. Change them into a plus. What do I now have in the top? 25 negatives and 28 positives. So that, of course, is going to leave me 3 positives. So I have 3/40ths, and that does not reduce, and so my answer is 3/40ths. Okay, if it would have reduced, I would have reduced it, but this one did not reduce. One more example. C. And again, if you have any mixed numbers, you should just have to deal with them. Let's do this. Let's do negative 3 1/2. And we'll go minus a minus 5/6. Negative 3 1/2 minus a minus 5/6. Okay. So if you recall, we have to take this mixed number and turn it into a fraction. That's our first step. Hopefully you remember how to do this. Don't forget I told you to put that negative. Let me get that in red. Remember I told you to take that negative and put it out in front and use a parentheses. So it's going to be the 3 times the 2 plus the 1 in the numerator, right? And then all over that 2 on the bottom. That's changing that to an improper fraction. Some students like to do this right now. They like to do their minus right now and change it to a plus in the middle. That's okay. That'll work. You do have minus a minus. Okay, and we've got 5/6. So let's clean up what we've got. We've got a negative 7/2 plus a 5/6. Okay. How do you deal with fractions? You got to get a common denominator. Hey, I can make the 2 on the bottom of the first fraction a 6 by multiplying it by 3 on the bottom, right? And remember, whatever you do to the bottom, you're going to do the same thing at the top. We're really changing the form. We're not changing the value, and that's the key to the whole thing. Change the form, do not change the value. Okay, so if I did the rule step right here, it would look like this. Negative 21 plus 5 over the common denominator of 6. 21 negatives and 5 positives. Start at 5, count up to 21, figure out how many negatives are left. That's 16 of them. I get a negative 16/6. Oh, I can reduce this. I certainly can reduce this. Let's change the negative 16 to a negative 8 times 2. Let's change the 6 to 2 times 3. Our common 2's divide out. And what is our answer? Our answer ends up as a negative 8/3. All right, a lot of review there, but important stuff. And we've got to be good with our fractions. And that's how your work's going to look. That's how these things should go. All right. Again, don't forget we didn't have class the last 3 days, so we've got to make up that time. So not only are you watching your video at home, you do need to do the homework assignment. And this is page 20, 1 through 4, 7, 15 through 20, 26, 39, and 50. All right, have a great night.